Prince William did not raise his voice. He did not accuse anyone, threaten anyone, or turn the moment into a spectacle. He simply looked across a room filled with people who understood exactly how dangerous memory can become inside a monarchy, and delivered one sentence: "Diana is the woman this royal family will never replace." What followed was not applause, it was silence. The kind of silence that tells you everyone has understood the message differently. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William had entered the private Windsor gathering, expecting a serious discussion about the monarchy's public identity and future direction. Windsor, in this context, refers to the royal household setting where senior family conversations and planning can take place away from public ceremonies. The discussion had been structured around image, trust, continuity, and the changing expectations placed on senior royals. Yet the prince changed the entire emotional direction of the meeting when he brought Diana into it without warning. William paused before saying her name. The future king remained controlled, but the emotion beneath his words was impossible to miss. Catherine watched him closely, because she understood what was happening beneath the surface. He was not speaking only as a senior royal preparing for greater responsibility. He was speaking as Diana's son, carrying memories of childhood, loss, and public grief into a room built around institutional strategy. Charles did not move quickly after the sentence landed. The king remained seated, with his hands clasped, knowing that Diana's memory touched some of the most painful chapters of his own life and the monarchy's modern history. Camilla reacted more subtly, but the queen consort understood the comparison immediately. William had not attacked her. He had not even mentioned her name. Yet by declaring Diana irreplaceable, he placed a boundary around memory that no present royal woman could easily cross. William then made the meaning harder to dismiss. Diana's legacy, he argued, was not simply about nostalgia or public fascination with the past. Her emotional connection with ordinary people had created a standard of trust that could not simply be reassigned through titles, ceremony, or carefully managed image. Catherine listened as the prince separated admiration from imitation. Remembering his mother did not mean recreating her, but forgetting what made people trust her would be a mistake. A senior aide quietly closed the briefing folder when William finished. The gesture said what nobody else dared to say aloud. The planned discussion had effectively collapsed. Strategy had become family history. Then Charles finally raised his eyes toward his son. William had spoken Diana's name before the family, but to understand why those words struck Charles and Camilla so differently, the people standing behind the silence must first be understood. For William, Diana is not a chapter in royal history. She is his mother. For Charles, she represents love, failure, grief, and one of the most scrutinized relationships of his life. And for Camilla, Diana's memory is something far more complicated, a presence that cannot enter a room physically, yet can still transform its emotional balance within seconds. William's statement forced all three realities into collision. William had spent much of his adult life doing something almost impossible, protecting his mother's memory while preparing to inherit leadership of the same institution that had become painfully intertwined with her life. The monarchy, in simple terms, is both a family and a public institution built around the sovereign and those who serve alongside them. For the prince, Diana belonged to both worlds. She was personal memory, but she was also part of the public story he would one day inherit. Charles carried a different burden. The king and Camilla had built a marriage, a partnership, and a new royal reality after years of controversy. Yet Diana remained deeply present in the emotional memory of the public, and, even more powerfully, in the lives of her sons. The queen consort understood that history could not simply be rewritten because circumstances had changed. Charles understood it too, even when acknowledging that truth remained painful. William stood alone after the gathering, until Catherine approached him quietly. The prince admitted that he had not planned the exact sentence he delivered in the room. He had known what he wanted to say, but not how directly it would come out. Remaining silent, he told her, had begun to feel dishonest. Catherine listened carefully because she understood that her husband had crossed an emotional line he could not easily uncross. Charles confronted the meaning elsewhere. The king asked Camilla whether she believed William had intended the declaration as criticism of her. The queen consort answered carefully that she did not think the words had been designed as an attack. But the pause before she spoke told him something else. They had landed personally, whether William intended that or not. Catherine understood the deeper message before many others did. William was not trying to restore Diana's era. He was defining the emotional philosophy he wanted attached to his own future reign. Visibility, empathy, directness, and a willingness to connect with people without hiding behind ceremony. The future king was not copying his mother. He was choosing which parts of her example he believed the monarchy could not afford to lose. Charles eventually reached the same conclusion. If Diana became an openly acknowledged influence on William's future monarchy, then a chapter the king had spent decades trying to contain would become part of the institution's emotional inheritance. And that realization made the next discovery even more uncomfortable. The statement sounded spontaneous, but its emotional fuse had already been lit, and the moment that ignited it occurred during a conversation the family never expected to become decisive. Weeks before William spoke Diana's name at Windsor, another meeting ended very differently. There was no dramatic declaration, no raised voice, and no public argument. Instead, William sat through a discussion about how the monarchy should describe its modern identity and heard a suggestion that disturbed him enough to remain on his mind long after everyone had left. That quiet meeting became the trigger. Later, everyone involved would understand it as the point of no return. William had arrived at Clarence House, expecting a controlled strategy discussion. Clarence House, in simple terms, is a royal residence in London that has also been used for private meetings and official work connected to senior members of the family. Advisors began discussing a unified narrative that would present the monarchy's modern female figures as part of one continuous tradition of service, emotional leadership, and public connection. One proposed briefing went further. It placed Diana, Camilla, Catherine, and other senior royal women inside the same broad institutional story, describing their contributions as different stages in the evolution of a similar public role. William reacted immediately. The prince set down his pen and told the room that his mother's place could not be reduced to a transitional position that someone else had simply inherited. The temperature of the meeting changed at once. Charles pushed back carefully. The king insisted that nobody was trying to erase Diana or diminish what she had meant to the public. He argued that the discussion was about continuity, not replacement. But William heard something else beneath the language. To the future king, the proposal sounded like an attempt to make a painful and complicated history easier for the institution to explain by smoothing away the differences that made it uncomfortable. William carried that frustration with him after the meeting. In a private conversation with Catherine later that day, the prince said that calling Diana one chapter among many fundamentally misunderstood why people had connected with her in the first place. Catherine listened as he explained that the issue was not titles, rank, or nostalgia. It was authenticity. Diana had not mattered because she perfectly fitted an institutional role. She had mattered because people believed they could feel the person beneath it. Catherine understood that distinction immediately. She also understood what it meant for William's future. The prince was no longer willing to let carefully balanced language turn his mother into something easier to categorize. He told her that if Diana's legacy was discussed again, in a way he considered too convenient, he would answer plainly. William kept that promise at Windsor. But the moment he finally said the words aloud, Charles refused to let the meaning remain unchallenged. The trigger explained William's resolve. What came next would reveal whether Charles could hear his son's words as remembrance or only as judgment. The door closed. The aides stayed outside, and for several seconds neither man spoke. William had spent years learning how to address Charles as both father and sovereign. Charles had spent just as long learning that conversations about Diana could never be merely historical when his sons were involved. Now there was nowhere for either man to hide. One sentence had exposed decades of grief, and father and son were finally forced to confront what it meant. Charles had asked William to remain behind after the Windsor gathering ended. The king wanted no advisors, no Catherine, no Camilla, and no carefully softened language between them. A sovereign, in plain terms, is the reigning monarch who carries the formal authority of the crown. But in that room, Charles was also a father, facing a son who had just reopened one of the most painful subjects of his life. He asked William directly whether calling Diana irreplaceable meant he believed the family had spent years trying to replace her. William held his father's gaze and answered carefully. The prince said his concern was not Charles's marriage and not Camilla's position beside him. His concern was what happened whenever the institution tried to package Diana's memory into language that made the past easier to explain. To William, that was the real danger. The future king believed his mother's uniqueness could not be turned into a smooth transition between one royal era and another without losing what made her matter. Charles reacted sharply. The king pushed his chair backward and stood, telling William that he had lived with the consequences of that history every day. He did not need anyone reminding him of what had been lost, what had failed, or how deeply the family had suffered. The monarch's anger was restrained, but beneath it sat something heavier than irritation. William had touched a grief Charles had learned to carry quietly. William refused to retreat. The prince told his father that remembering Diana was not punishment. He argued that acknowledging what she changed might actually be the only way the family stopped treating her memory as something dangerous. If every mention of Diana reopened fear, then the wound would remain in control forever. Charles listened differently after that. William then revealed the part his father had misunderstood. The statement had ultimately been about his own future. The prince said he would not build his reign by pretending painful history had not shaped him. Diana's influence would remain part of the values he carried forward, just as Charles's experiences had shaped his own approach to the crown. Charles's anger softened, but the problem had already grown beyond the two of them. The confrontation exposed the wound, but behind the family drama stood another struggle, one concerned not with grief alone, but with who gets to shape the monarchy's official memory. Royal families do not simply inherit palaces and crowns, they inherit narratives. Every speech, anniversary, exhibition, tribute, and official biography helps decide which memories remain central and which gradually move toward the margins. William understood that uncomfortable truth. His declaration had therefore done something more consequential than unsettling a family gathering. It had announced that when it came to Diana, the future king intended to have a voice. William knew that royal memory was never controlled by one person alone. The sovereign, senior working royals, communications advisors, archivists, and household officials all influence how the monarchy explains its past. Archivists, in simple terms, are the people responsible for preserving and organizing historical records so future generations can understand what happened and why. As Prince of Wales and future king, William also carried growing influence over how his own family, priorities, and understanding of royal service would eventually be presented. A senior advisor met William privately after the Windsor confrontation and spoke with unusual caution. The official warned that repeatedly invoking Diana could reopen comparisons that placed Charles under renewed pressure and made Camilla's position especially painful. The prince listened without interrupting. He understood the concern, but he also understood where that argument could lead if left unchallenged. William closed the briefing folder and answered with deliberate calm. The future king said he would never use his mother as a weapon against Charles, Camilla, or anyone else. But he would not participate in making Diana's memory smaller, simply because acknowledging her full impact made others uncomfortable. To him, that distinction was the entire point. Remembrance did not have to become accusation. William made his position even clearer. He was not demanding that Diana dominate every royal story or appear in every discussion about the monarchy's future. The prince was demanding that her singular cultural and emotional impact be acknowledged honestly, rather than absorbed into vague language about continuity. Diana had connected with people in a way that could not be reduced to a standard role description, and he believed pretending otherwise weakened the truth rather than protecting the institution. Catherine supported that balance in a private conversation afterward. She encouraged William to keep remembrance separate from comparison. The princess understood that Diana's legacy could stand on its own without requiring another royal woman to be diminished beside it. William agreed. He did not want a contest between past and present. He wanted honesty strong enough to hold both. But that careful balance was about to face its hardest test. Camilla received an account of William's private remarks and understood immediately that his position was not temporary emotion. The queen consort now knew the future king intended to hold that boundary firmly. William had drawn the boundary with advisors. Now the person most inevitably compared with Diana would be forced to decide whether she could live with it. Camilla had survived decades of headlines, hostility, reinvention, and relentless comparison. She had learned how to keep walking when rooms turned cold, and how to smile when old photographs resurfaced. But William's declaration was different, because it did not come from a columnist or commentator. It came from Diana's son, and from the man expected one day to define the monarchy after Charles. That made the words impossible to dismiss. Charles chose to tell Camilla himself. The king did not leave her to hear an altered version through staff whispers or private palace gossip. He explained that William had insisted the statement was not an attack on their marriage, but he also admitted something harder. The prince intended to give Diana a clearly acknowledged place within the emotional philosophy of his future monarchy. The future monarchy, in simple terms, means the values, priorities, and public character William may one day bring to the crown if he becomes king. Camilla listened without interrupting. The queen consort sat quietly beside a small table, removed her glasses, and finally asked the question that carried years of exhaustion inside it. Would there ever be a point, she asked Charles, when she could exist without being measured against someone who had died decades earlier? The words were not angry. That made them heavier. Charles knew exactly what she meant, because comparison had followed their relationship through every stage of public life. Charles answered with painful honesty. The king told her the comparison was unfair, but he could not promise it would disappear. Diana's place in public memory was too deep, and William's connection to that memory was too personal. The admission hurt more than easy reassurance would have. Camilla understood that he was not choosing Diana over her. He was admitting that neither of them possessed the power to control how memory worked. Then Camilla surprised him. The queen consort refused to demand that William retract what he had said. She told Charles that forcing the prince into silence would only deepen resentment and make Diana's memory feel even more forbidden. If William truly believed his mother shaped the kind of king he hoped to become, Camilla understood that silencing him would turn remembrance into another family battle. That decision changed the conflict. William was no longer being pushed toward retreat. Camilla was no longer asking Charles to protect her by suppressing his son. The question became much harder. Could Diana be acknowledged as unique, without making everyone who came afterward feel like a substitute? Only one conversation could answer that. William and Camilla would have to speak without advisors, without Charles mediating, and without the hierarchy of monarch and heir hanging between them. The fallout had exposed everyone's deepest insecurity. The turning point would come only when the two people positioned on opposite sides of Diana's memory finally spoke alone. There was no throne, no press secretary, no carefully prepared statement, and perhaps that was why the conversation mattered. William and Camilla had spent years occupying places inside the same family while carrying entirely different relationships to one absent woman. Diana was William's mother. For Camilla, she was an unavoidable presence in the story of her marriage. Now, without Charles between them, both finally confronted the meaning of a comparison that had shaped their lives. William requested the conversation after realizing his declaration had landed more personally than he intended. The prince wanted no Charles, No advisors, and no household officials in the room. Household officials, in simple terms, are the senior staff who help organize royal duties, communication, and internal administration. Removing them mattered because neither William nor Camilla wanted the exchange interpreted as a negotiation between the future king and the queen consort. For once, this was simply family. Camilla spoke first. The queen consort told William she understood why he had defended Diana's place, but admitted that the word replace had hurt. For years, she said, the public story around her had often suggested that her very existence depended on occupying a space that once belonged to somebody else. She had learned to live with that comparison, but hearing language so close to it from Diana's own son made the old insecurity impossible to ignore. William answered without becoming defensive. The prince told Camilla that her interpretation was precisely what he wanted to challenge. Diana could not be replaced, because no individual human being could truly be replaced. That did not mean Camilla was trying to become her. It meant the monarchy should stop treating women as interchangeable occupants of one emotional role. The future king wanted both truths to exist, without forcing one woman's identity to cancel out another's. William then admitted that his deepest concern stretched beyond the adults involved. He thought about George, Charlotte, and Louis. The prince did not want his children inheriting a royal family where painful history had to be avoided simply to preserve appearances. If they were expected one day to carry public responsibility, he wanted them to understand that honesty about grief and failure could strengthen duty rather than weaken it. Camilla absorbed the distinction quietly. The queen consort did not ask William to soften his position, and he did not ask her to pretend the words had not hurt. Instead, something unexpectedly simple emerged between them: recognition. Camilla told William before they parted that Diana belonged to his story. The prince, she said, should never feel he needed permission to speak about his mother with love. For the first time, the comparison stopped behaving like a weapon. But beyond the palace walls, William's original declaration was already taking on a life of its own. Inside the family, the temperature had finally begun to fall. Outside it, William's words were becoming one of the most emotionally charged royal statements in years. By the following morning, William's sentence no longer belonged to the private room where it had been spoken. It was on television screens, newspaper covers, phones, breakfast tables, and conversations across Britain. But something unexpected happened as the words spread. The public response did not focus only on palace conflict. For thousands who remembered Diana, and millions who knew her through photographs and stories, the statement reopened an emotional connection the monarchy had never completely lost. William watched the fictional declaration move into the national conversation faster than anyone around him had expected. Broadcasters began debating Diana's enduring influence and what it meant that the future king had spoken about her so directly. National broadcasters, in simple terms, are major television and radio networks that report events to audiences across the country. Some commentators treated the sentence as a sign of the prince asserting greater independence. Others heard something much simpler: a son refusing to let his mother become merely another chapter in royal history. Charles absorbed the coverage differently. The king remained seated as old material connected to Diana returned alongside discussions of William's words. He could have turned away. Instead, he stayed with it. The monarch had spent years understanding that certain parts of history could never be fully controlled. Yet hearing his eldest son placed so closely beside that past forced the lesson into the present. Avoiding Diana had never erased her influence. It had only delayed conversations the family still needed to have. Catherine noticed another danger immediately. The princess saw William becoming increasingly uncomfortable as reports suggested his statement had been aimed directly at Camilla. She reminded him privately that public debate often compresses complicated emotions into simple conflict. William knew she was right, but the prince still disliked seeing remembrance transformed into accusation. He had spoken about Diana's uniqueness, not about diminishing another woman. Then the public response became more personal. In this fictional account, visitors outside Kensington Palace began leaving flowers near gates long associated in public memory with Diana. One handwritten card carried only 5 words: "A mother cannot be replaced." Evening broadcasts repeatedly returned to that message, and suddenly William's sentence felt less like palace strategy and more like collective memory rising to the surface again. A major fictional newspaper pushed that interpretation even further. Its front page placed William's declaration beneath parallel photographs of the prince and Diana, presenting the story as one generation speaking to another, rather than merely another royal dispute. Charles saw the image and understood why it carried such force. William was not asking Britain to choose between past and present. He was asking the monarchy to admit that the past had helped create the future. And for the first time, Charles stopped hearing the sentence only through the pain attached to Diana's name. The public had delivered its emotional answer. Now only one verdict mattered inside the family, the one Charles had been resisting since William first spoke. In the end, the statement that appeared capable of dividing the royal family forced it to acknowledge something far simpler and far more human. Diana did not need to defeat Camilla in history. Camilla did not need to defeat Diana. Charles did not need to rewrite his past, and William did not need permission to love his mother openly. The crisis existed because the word "replace" assumed there had ever been an empty position waiting for another woman to fill. Charles asked William to meet one final time after seeing how deeply the public had responded. The king entered that conversation differently from before. There was no sharp challenge and no attempt to defend the past before hearing his son. William understood the shift immediately. Their earlier argument had been about what Diana's memory threatened to reopen. This time, father and son were finally discussing what that memory might be allowed to mean. Charles acknowledged something he had resisted saying so plainly. Diana's relationship with the public had been unique. The monarch accepted that William's future reign would naturally carry influences from both parents, including lessons born from their marriage, separation, mistakes, and pain. A future reign, in simple terms, means the period in which William would lead the monarchy if he eventually becomes king. Charles could no longer expect his eldest son to inherit responsibility without also inheriting the emotional history that shaped him. Charles then admitted why William's original sentence had hurt. The king said he had first heard, "Diana is the woman this royal family will never replace," as condemnation, as though his son were passing judgment on everything that followed her. William answered quietly that he had meant remembrance, not punishment. The prince wanted his mother recognized as an individual whose place could not be transferred to someone else. Silence followed, before Charles finally nodded. He understood the difference now. William made his own boundary equally clear. The future king told his father that honoring Diana would never require humiliating Camilla. The queen consort had her own identity, her own marriage, and her own place within the family. Catherine deserved the same freedom. The princess should not be expected to become a continuation of Diana simply because she would one day carry responsibilities associated with the same royal generation. That became the family's emotional settlement. Diana could be remembered for her compassion, flaws, pain, motherhood, and extraordinary connection with the public without turning her memory into a competition. Camilla could stand apart from that legacy rather than beneath it. Catherine could shape her own role without carrying an impossible comparison. William's declaration had sounded like a line drawn in anger. In the end, it became something closer to liberation. By saying Diana could never be replaced, the prince removed the expectation that anyone should ever have to try. Charles could acknowledge the past without surrendering the present. Camilla could remain herself, and William could carry his mother's influence into the future without hiding where it came from. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.